Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar at the New York City Bar Association. Today's program on the Senate filibuster, abolish, restrict, or live with features an extraordinary panel of participants and a program that will be moderated by former Appellate Division Justice Marcy Kahn. I'm Stephen Cass. I'm chair of the City Bar Task Force on the Rule of Law. I welcome you to this program and I hope you enjoy it. Marcy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Steve. I'm delighted to lead off our extremely timely session sponsored by the Rule of Law Task Force and the Election Law Committee, asking the Senate filibuster, abolish, restrict, or live with. With the US Senate split 50-50, the opportunities for the Biden administration and the Democratic-controlled Congress to advance many parts of their ambitious legislative agenda, including voting rights protection, climate change, criminal justice reform, portions of the infrastructure agenda, and even creation of a January 6th commission, will hinge on the effect the Senate filibuster will have on such measures. As a result, interest has been renewed in proposals for reforming or even eliminating Senate Rule 22, the Senate filibuster rule. Since 1975, 60 votes in the Senate have been required for cloture, that is, for ending debate, and for passage of most major legislation. Whether or not a change in that rule is desirable, and if so, what form it should take, is currently the subject of intense national debate. Our program today will examine the question of whether the rule of law is promoted by retaining, eliminating, or reforming the Senate filibuster. And if the latter, how do we do it in a way that would be effective, nonpartisan, enduring, and truly democratic? We're very fortunate today to have with us three experts, three real thought leaders on this subject, whose scholarly analyses have been informed by their unique historical and experiential study of the issue. We will hear from Professor Sarah Binder, former Senator Russ Feingold, and Professor Norm Ornstein. They have some divergent views on the merits and drawbacks of the current rule, as well as what should and can be done about it. And our conversation today promises to be lively. Their bios have been included in the email you received about the program, so I'm only briefly going to introduce them during the program. Our format will be as follows. Each of our speakers will offer a presentation, and a question and answer session will follow once all of the speakers have concluded their remarks. I will be joined in putting questions to them by Jerry Goldfeder of the Election Law Committee. We invite you and members of the audience to put your own questions into the Q&A function by clicking the tab at the bottom of your screen. We will not be using the chat function for questions, and all but the presenters will be muted. Our first speaker will be Sarah A. Binder, who is professor of political science at George Washington University and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. She specializes in Congress and legislative politics and has written extensively in that area. She is co-author of Politics or Principle, Filibustering in the United States Senate. She will give us the long view of the 200-year history of the filibuster, including any trends it has had on certain types of legislation and certain interests. Professor Binder, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thanks very much for including me today. So I'm going to start us off, as Marcy suggested, with the broad view. I want to offer three takeaways about the origins and the evolution of the Senate filibuster, and then we can dive into the politics and the history that underlie these three broad generalizations. So first, filibusters are an age-old problem for the Senate. Majorities for almost 2 centuries have struggled with minority obstruction. Those conflicts historically have fallen along both sectional lines, meaning slavery and civil rights most prominently, but also along just sheer partisan lines. And not just today's divisions between Democrats and Republicans, but all the way back to the Whigs and the Democrats before the Civil War. Second broad observation, all the way back to the mid-19th century, leading senators have sought to rein in the filibuster. And the Senate, of course, still struggles to find an acceptable balance between minority rights and majority rule. Third, senators from both political parties have at times voted to curtail the rights of the minority. True, the filibuster is in many ways alive and well, and we'll probably see that this week or next. But the broader pattern of Senate history is clear. And that is, in my view, the long arc of Senate history really is bending towards majority rule. Even if the path is rocky, it is uneven, and it is ongoing. So now you know where I'm headed. We can dive into the history that sustains those three broad generalizations. So I first started investigating the political history of the filibuster some almost 25 years ago, writing a book with my political science colleague, Stephen Smith, who was then at the University of Minnesota. And we discovered pretty quickly that no feature of legislative procedure had received more attention but less scrutiny than the Senate filibuster. It was definitely the only congressional rule that had ever been the focus of a Hollywood film, starring no less than Jimmy Stewart. When I talk to undergrads about filibuster, I have to tell them who Jimmy Stewart was, but I trust I don't need to do that today. So when we dig into the history, and when we did it a quarter century ago, we discovered then, and it remains more or less true today, that the filibuster has been sustained for decades on a series of myths, a set of what we thought of as misunderstandings about the rule, its origins, and its impact over Senate history. So I want to organize our historical tour here around three of these myths. First, the origins myth, the notion that the filibuster was part of the original design for the Senate. Second, we'll call it the golden age myth, that the 19th century Senate was a golden age of Senate deliberation made possible by the filibuster and prized by leading senators of the day. And third, the majoritarian myth, the idea that Senate majorities have always preferred minority rule, that the Senate today retains the legislative filibuster because that's what majorities want. So I want to take each of these myths in turn and kind of consider the range of evidence that we have for them. First, the origins myth. Many people, including most of today's senators, believe that the filibuster was an original feature of the Senate, that it was the essential factor distinguishing the two chambers of Congress, and that the framers of the Constitution explicitly designed the Senate to reflect the interests of the minority. But there is very little evidence to support that interpretation of Senate origins. The framers of the Constitution, as we know, empowered the Senate and the House to write their own rules. Article 1, Section 5, the rulemaking clause. Many of those framers made clear that allowing a minority to veto the preferred policies of the majority would produce undesirable outcomes. And neither senators nor the framers expected that more than a majority would ever be needed to secure passage, other than for treaties and veto overrides. But most importantly, procedural differences between the House and Senate were not part of the framers or the chamber's original designs. Those differences, what became a very partisan majoritarian House and what we might call a minoritarian Senate, those differences resulted from political developments that occurred over the course of the chamber's first few decades. So where was the filibuster from? Like, where did it come from if it was not original to the Senate? Well, if you'll indulge me a few minutes to take us back to the early 1800s, when the first House and Senate, late 1789, met, they both designed a set of rules, and they had roughly the same rulebook. Both rulebooks had what we call a previous question motion. If you look at the House floor today, when they are ready to cut off debate and move to a vote, somebody moves the previous question. It's just a majority vote, it cuts off to debate. So in the original House and Senate, they both had a previous question motion, but the motion did not work that way. It was infrequently used, and it often, and this is a little contorted here, but it often had the opposite effect. You might move the previous question, and even if there was a majority for it, it prolonged debate, it didn't cut off debate. So what happened in this context of a set of rules that had not yet been honed into their contemporary uses? It's 1805, Aaron Burr, that Broadway musical star, had just killed off Alexander Hamilton the year before, and he gives his farewell speech to the Senate. He says, "Hey, Senate, you are a remarkable deliberative body, but your rule book," I'm paraphrasing here, "is a mess." And he begins to point to rules that he thinks could be deleted or modified. And he points to the previous question motion. And he says, "You hardly use this. It actually postpones measures. You can just drop it." 1806, senators clean up the rule book and they drop the previous question motion. Now, hold on to that thought for one moment. Over in the House, a few years later, 1811, in the buildup to the War of 1812, wasn't called the War of 1812 then, I don't think, but in 1811, the House majority is trying to pass a bill relative to the war between the French and the British, and they keep encountering obstruction, and they take that previous question motion, they reinterpret it as a cloture motion. That means they use it for a majority to cut off debate. And the House is off to the races. They can further refine the previous question motion over the years to become an instrument of majority rule. But back in the Senate, 1820s, 1830s, we get partisanship, we get real parties, we get the 1840s, we get divisions over slavery begin to emerge, and senators discover that they can talk all night. And there was no rule to empower a majority to cut off debate. Why not? I can only conclude Aaron Burr. The best of the evidence suggests that getting rid of the previous question motion was a mistake, meaning that the move had unanticipated consequences and probably unintended consequences too of creating the filibuster. That was not the reason they did away with the previous question motion, but having gotten rid of the motion when senators needed it to cut off debate, they did not have a rule ready at hand, like they saw over in the House, to cut off debate. And that's why there really is very little that's true about the origins myth. So the second myth, the Golden Age myth, we have this notion that Senate deliberation flourished in the 19th century because of the filibuster. Filibusters, we're told, were reserved for the big issues of the day, not trivial partisan filibusters, and that senators and their leaders liked it that way. Turns out there's very little of that turns out to be true as well. Now, it's certainly the case that Southerners were the first to fully develop the filibuster as an instrument of obstruction in pursuit of racial segregation, protecting slavery in the South, and protecting its extension into the slaveries and newly admitted states. But many filibusters in this period were just plain old partisan. By my count, the first real filibusters occurred over the censure of Andrew Jackson, over the appointment of new Senate printers, and later in the 19th century, the most commonly filibustered measure was probably spending bills, often taken hostage by the minority party. What's more, Senate leaders, the great 19th century Senate leaders during this golden age, from Henry Clay to Henry Cabot Lodge to Nelson Aldrich, they all fought not to protect the filibuster, but to abolish it. Even John C. Calhoun, when he served in the House in 1811, he voted to weaponize the previous question motion into a tool of majority rule. It's only when he came to the Senate and found himself defending slavery that he decided to weaponize the lack of debate limits into a tool for the minority. Again, right, where you stand depends on where you sit, even for John C. Calhoun. So did majorities really prefer majority rule? Well, we might ask, if they didn't, why didn't the Senate just ban filibusters? It turns out, typically, when leaders did try to ban the filibuster, you can imagine what happened. Senators just filibustered the motion to ban the filibuster. And that means, first of all, the filibuster is sustained into the 20th century, but it also means we don't really have an archival record to tell us what majorities really thought about the filibuster, right? Often when a majority faced a filibuster over banning the filibuster, they basically gave in. They gave up on procedural reform And they also gave up on whatever the bill was that provoked the filibuster in the first place. And they moved on to other pressing issues on their agenda rather than getting stuck on the bill that was being filibustered. Well, 1917, we finally get cloture in the Senate, a rule for cutting off debate. But senators then set the rule to require a 2/3 vote of senators present voting to cut off debate. Why did Senate leaders succeed when they'd failed before? And why 2/3? Why not a majority to cut off debate? The battle comes in the run-up to World War I. In the briefest version here, Woodrow Wilson, as president, rails against what he called 11 willful men, senators blocking a key measure to arm merchant ships in the run-up to World War I, the US entry into World War I. Wilson frames the filibuster question as a matter of national security. Are you for or against the US national interest? And by fusing the issue of security with the issue of Senate procedure, obstructionists eventually buckle. They sit down to work out a cloture rule. Democrats, most of them wanted a majority cloture rule. Republicans wanted a 3/4 rule. The compromise, 2/3. So that decision to require 2/3 of senators to cut off debate had nothing to do with procedural principle about unlimited debate or about the appropriate balance of majority and minority rule. It was just barefisted politics, right? Who would have enough votes to get the cloture rule that they wanted? So cloture is established in the early 20th century. Now, to speed up our history here, I just want to offer two broad points about the evolution of the filibuster over the 20th century that will set up Senator Feingold for telling us more about the contemporary Senate and the filibuster. So first, two broad points. One, the battle over civil rights colored both the use of the filibuster in this 20th century period, but also it colored efforts to reform the filibuster through the 1960s. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. But the second broad point is to keep in mind that after liberals broke the back of civil rights filibusters in the 1960s, the filibuster seeped everywhere across the Senate and across the policy spectrum. And we want to say just a little bit to wrap us up at that point when we're done here. So just a few words then about both of these points. The first one about civil rights. It's very clear that the filibuster killed measures that otherwise likely would have been enacted into law. When Steve Smith and I began digging into the 20th century filibuster history, we wanted to identify all of the measures that were actually killed by a filibuster. That is, there had to be evidence of support for the measure by a House majority, by a Senate majority, and by the president. We found about 30 such measures between 1917 and 94 when we were writing, and exactly half of those addressed civil rights. It included measures to prohibit and prosecute lynching, to ban the imposition of poll taxes, to prohibit discrimination on the basis of race in housing sales and rentals. And of course, the 20th century filibuster scorched many civil rights measures beyond those that it killed outright. We can see the effects of the filibuster even in measures that were enacted into law. We think about senators when they secured passage of celebrated measures to address racial equity, Civil Rights Act of 57 and 64, right? Those contain very certain the 57 Act had a lot of compromises in it that were necessary in order to overcome the filibusters by segregationist senators. And of course, that general history is surely why former President Obama last year called the filibuster a Jim Crow relic. Civil rights plays another role in the history of that 20th century filibuster in that battles over reforming the cloture rule become proxy wars over civil rights. In 3/4 of the reform efforts over the 20th century, senators' positions on civil rights shape their votes on cloture reform, right? Even after we take account of all the other forces that might have influenced their votes. It's only after senators defeated civil rights filibusters in the 1960s did attitudes about reforming the filibuster become less tied to attitudes about civil rights. Of course, the waning of the civil rights era was made possible by, but also amplified changes in the makeup of the Democratic and Republican parties. And as the parties begin to change after the civil rights era, the nature of the filibuster in the period changes as well. Most importantly, a period of relatively low partisanship in the 1970s, both conservatives and liberals begin to filibuster as the agenda grows and expands with the environmental movement, women's rights movement, consumer rights, and so forth. That spread of filibusters and endless amendments frustrated Senate leaders from both political parties. And in the early 1970s, Senate Democratic leaders, with the support of Republican leaders, began to try to better manage the Senate. Senators Byrd and Mansfield created what we call tracking. If it looked like senators were going to filibuster a measure, the Senate Majority Leader would secure unanimous consent, meaning from the minority as well, to move the Senate onto a second track of business. So if Republicans were going to, say, amend an environmental protection bill to death, Democrats would open a new track to debate an issue, say, on occupational safety and health. So reformers in this period were still trying to change the Senate rules to lower the cloture threshold, right? Even though it was no longer a proxy battle over civil rights. So we have two things going on here, the move to tracking and the move to lower the threshold. 1975, a bipartisan coalition votes to lower the threshold to 60 votes. Why did all this matter? Because cloture then becomes the tool for managing the Senate. There's very little incentive to engage in what we now call a talking filibuster. It's just much easier for the majority leader to try to count up votes for cloture than to gauge the intensity of your opponents and to figure out whether they have the willpower to hold the floor and filibuster all night. And so filibustering becomes less costly, we say, to senators, but also to majority leaders in some ways now that they have a cloture rule. But unfortunately for Senate leaders, over the last several decades, the size of the majority parties have gotten smaller and smaller, but the cloture rule has stayed at 60. So finally, to wrap us up here, my point about filibusters seeping across the Senate. With the rise in partisanship after the 1980s, senators from both parties find new targets to filibuster. We see that in two, I think, important ways. First, senators begin to filibuster more procedural motions, not just final passage. They begin, starting in the early 90s, to filibuster the motion to proceed. They filibuster motion to go to conference, to name conferees. They filibuster conference reports and so forth. Second, senators begin to filibuster nominations, both for federal judges and for executive branch officials. But what's most remarkable to me about this latter development is that majorities, Democratic and Republican alike, ban those filibusters. If you look at all the times the Senate has used what we call the nuclear option, that is, we can come back to this, sort of changing or reinterpreting the rules with a majority vote to set a new precedent. If you look at the use of the nuclear option, it has overwhelmingly targeted procedures of advice and consent. So over Senate history, there have been Senate majorities for majority rule. We do not have one of those majorities today for abolishing the legislative filibuster. But it does seem to me that the longer arc of Senate history is moving slowly towards majority rule. Will they actually ban the legislative filibuster someday? I don't know. But as Senator Shelby of Alabama put it a little while ago, it's hard to put the toothpaste back in the tube, right? As the Senate takes steps to curtail minority rights, senators very rarely, if ever, take steps backwards to restore those rights. And that's why Senate history here strikes me as a march, unsteady as it is, towards eventually majority rule. And I'm going to stop right there.
Thank you very much, Professor Binder, for that very informative background. So our next speaker is Russell Feingold, president of the American Constitution Society and former United States Senator for Wisconsin, and he served in that capacity from 1993 to 2011. During his 3 terms in the Senate, Senator Feingold was ranked 6th in the Senate for bipartisan voting. And we all recall his joining with Senator John McCain to enable the passage of the campaign finance law, which bore both their names. He will provide some insight for us into how the filibuster rule has deteriorated and some lessons from his front seat view of the operation of the rule, including its effect on bipartisanship. Senator, the floor is yours. please unmute. I think you're still muted.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Marcy and Sarah. I greatly enjoyed your remarks. I agree with the myths that you put forward historically. I guess what I would like, the theme of what I say here is that the idea of partisanship dominating the filibuster has been a gradual process that really accelerated, actually, even since I've been in the Senate. And to me, that is the most destructive aspect of the filibuster, whether you believe it should be eliminated or reformed. In fact, if you go back to some of the history that Sarah mentioned, I mean, even before Aaron Burr, Thomas Jefferson, in his manual that he wrote when he was presiding over the Senate, when he was Adams vice president, he said that the motion for the previous question should only be used in very narrow circumstances. And that's how it was used in Parliament. So it wasn't just Aaron Burr, it was Thomas Jefferson who felt that way as to a slightly higher reputation. And then if you go into the point that Sarah made about the 19th century, look, they waited until the 20th century to ever actually have a cloture rule. So it was not seen as a crippling aspect of the Senate, nor was it necessarily partisan in terms of political parties. Of course, Sarah's absolutely right. The founders not only didn't have a filibuster in the founding document or in the original Senate rules, but the founders didn't even believe in political parties. They thought it was faction and dangerous. So the fact that this tool that's supposed to be there to allow deliberation becomes dominated by political parties is a real irony. And even the critical incident that Sarah mentions in the 20th century, the opposition to World War I by the 11 willful men, this was not a party issue. These were the prairie populists. Behind me, the leader, Robert M. La Follette, Fighting Bob La Follette, was one of the 11 that enraged Wilson. They didn't think we should go into World War I. And I think, a lot of us think they might have been right about that. So this wasn't about party, but it sure irritated the president to the point where Rule 22 was amended to create at least a way to stop a filibuster. And then bringing it forward, it's interesting as I watched Mr. Smith Goes to Washington again a few weeks ago to think about, that was really the glorification of the filibuster was before the civil rights, a lot of the civil rights legislation, a lot of movements. So this image of it as some glorious thing was there. And then it was really sullied when I was growing up by the fact that it was abused to oppose civil rights legislation. And then I could quickly move up to 1975, which Sarah just indicated. So she critically pointed out that Mike Mansfield instituted this two-track rule, which basically led to the so-called silent filibuster for good purposes. He wasn't trying to, necessarily destroy the filibuster. He just wanted to have the regular business of the Senate be able to proceed, filibuster in the morning and another bill in the afternoon. But the fact is, it devolved into something where somebody could just say, we're going to filibuster. And that has led to the current situation that is so different than Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, because where's the guy standing up and talking until he collapses? You don't have to. You can have a silent filibuster. So it sort of turned it into a mockery. So this is the filibuster that I encountered when I came to the Senate in 1993. But during that period, between 1993 and 2010, I would say for a good part of the time, it was not really used that often, nor was it particularly used for partisan purposes. We would get excited when we hear that somebody was going to filibuster. We'd wonder if they're going to hold the floor for a long time. And it was for things like Harry Reid not wanting a nuclear repository in Yucca Mountain in his state. I once filibustered for 4 hours against Barbara Mikulski, who was not happy with me, because my bitter enemies on dairy policy from Vermont had put in a provision that would change the pricing system. And those bitter enemies were Senators Leahy and Bernie Sanders. And of course, they were not enemies at all. But when it came to Wisconsin versus Vermont, they were my enemy. And so they stuck something in an appropriations bill that was going to change the system that we had had since the 1930s. And I got my staff to get a bunch of recipe books and the history of cheese. And I read recipes and the history of cheese for 4 hours until Senator Mikulski said, how long will the senator be speaking? And I said, well, answer the question without giving up my right to the floor. And I said, all right, I'll do it, Mr. President, until this provision is removed. And of course, they removed it because they wanted the regular appropriations bill to go ahead. So I guess my point is, these uses during the early 90s and even into the late 90s were not necessarily one party versus another. I'm not saying they're always done for the right reason, but they were not crippling the Senate. We would bring up appropriations bills separately. Bob Dole or George Mitchell would say, what amendments do we have? And more often than not, we would debate the amendments and there wouldn't be any filibuster. So that's really, maybe it was a brief golden age of the filibuster not being abused, but it started to change with the contract with America. And by all accounts, even though I was not in the Senate long after that, it got even worse after the Tea Party era, where suddenly both parties are using it almost as a matter of course. I'd be less than honest, even though I believe there needs to be at a minimum reform now, if I didn't say that there are elements of the filibuster that I found important and useful at times. And one example was the rise of the contract with America and the attempt that was made after their huge victory in 1994 and 1995 to start repealing many of the great labor and environmental laws of the 20th century. And when I was a young new senator, I had almost never spoken on the floor. And my chief of staff said to me, Russ, Senator Kennedy wants you on the floor immediately. And this guy was an icon of my life. And I thought I better get down there. So I go down there and he says, say something to defend the Davis-Bacon Act. So I got up and I read my speech for 5 minutes. And I stopped and I noticed he was talking to his staff and wasn't paying any attention to me. And I stopped. And he said, well, what are you doing? I said, I don't have anything more to say. He said, just keep talking. This is a filibuster. We're trying to prevent these guys from taking away these protections. So it's important to think about that because that is an example of where it seems that partisanship, the use of the filibuster, was actually a defensive mechanism to protect progressive interest. So, and others who are experts about this have written about it and have come to the conclusion that we shouldn't eliminate or greatly modify the filibuster. Having said that, I believe that things have reached the point now that it is so serious that major legislation about things like voting rights are filibustered on a partisan basis, that it has gone too far. And I agree with Reverend Warnock, Senator Warnock, who said, and I'm paraphrasing recently, the notion that you would protect the rights of the minority in the Senate to the exclusion of the rights of minorities and people across the country's right to vote is an absurdity, and it is. As important as the filibuster might be, and as important as deliberation is, the idea that it could be part of this partisan national movement to deny the most fundamental right to vote can't be tolerated. And so Norm will talk about various ways in which that might be accomplished, but I will just say now, exceptions can be made. Exceptions can be made for certain policies. Exceptions can be made where a rule is only suspended for a term, for a session or for a Congress. It does not have to be either or. But to me, the voting issue is critical. And I want to follow on one other point about this. One of the myths is that the filibuster blocks everything. That's just not true. As Sarah pointed out, when I was in the Senate, the filibuster did apply to an awful lot of things. It applied to all nominations. It doesn't apply to nominations at all now. The advise and consent, it's half of the whole filibuster is gone. The filibuster is gone when it comes to the Budget Act. That is a piece of legislation that overrode the filibuster. And so reconciliation is majority vote. You would not have had Obamacare without the fact that the filibuster doesn't always apply. With regard to various free trade agreements and procedures related to trade agreements, the filibuster does not apply. So to have a good conversation about this, we have to be clear, and Sarah alluded to this, that this is about what remains of the filibuster. Not just what remains of the legislative filibuster versus nominations, but parts of legislation are no longer subject to the filibuster. That is not to suggest that it's not a huge problem. The fact that it's blocking major campaign and ethics reform, the fact that it's blocking voting rights is all terribly important. And I believe that something has to be done. I was not a supporter of eliminating the filibuster while I was in the Senate. I argued with Chuck Schumer on that on occasion. But I do think we're in a dire situation now where something has to give to allow a critical legislation to go through, and perhaps it can be done and things can go back to some legitimate notion of unlimited debate based on certain rules and closure, but it can't be allowed to gut the very basis of our democracy and the increasingly partisan nature of the current filibuster. So I'll leave it at that, Marcy.
Thank you, Senator Feingold, for sharing your unique insights with us on the modern changes to practice in the operation of the rule. Our next and final presenter.
Whoop. I think you've frozen, Marcy. At least for me, you have.
Legislative practices and reform, and has testified in Congress and has deeply probed and written extensively on reforming the filibuster. He will discuss some of the ideas that have been floating around now on changing the filibuster rule, emphasizing a pragmatic approach. Professor Ornstein, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marcy, and thanks for putting on this panel. And let me say what a pleasure it is to be with my longtime friend and colleague, Sarah Binder. And I actually think that 25 minutes ought to be put out separately. It is as good a primer on the history and nature of the filibuster and the Senate as I have seen or read or heard. And it's also such a pleasure to be with my longtime friend, Russ Feingold. One of my great pleasures in life was working with him on a number of issues, including campaign finance reform and continuity of government. And I miss him in the Senate, and in particular now, given who replaced him. But that's another story. I want to make a couple of points to begin with that reinforce some of what's been said. Rules matter. They matter enormously, but rules interact directly with norms. And the biggest problem we have in the Senate now is not Rule 22 per se. It is the shredding of norms. And as Sarah suggested, some of that, and Russ suggested, some of that goes back to Newt Gingrich and what he did in the House. And there's a very interesting book actually called The Gingrich Senators about some of the, to put the kindest word on it, revolutionary House members who wanted to destroy the House, at least in theory, so they could save it, then moved on to the Senate and brought with them some of the norms that existed there. If you don't have norms, and the norms when we had a 60 vote threshold for nominations, it was fairly rare that we actually saw nominations blocked, or certainly not blocked for very long periods of time. Senators would use a practice called the hold, which was ineffectively threatening that they would deny unanimous consent or deny or create a filibuster for a nomination, sometimes because of the qualifications of the nominee, but often for extraneous purposes, but deals would be worked out. To give you an example of how the norms have been devastated, Senator Tom Cotton, during the Obama years, held up for 2 years the nomination of Cassandra Butts, an extraordinarily well-qualified and absolutely terrific nominee to be ambassador to the Bahamas, until she died of cancer while twisting in the wind. And he admitted afterwards that he did it because he didn't like Barack Obama. That's a norm disappearing. What happened with the filibuster is after the rule was changed, as Sarah said, in 1975, and I'm going to come back to that with, I think, a deeply unintended consequence of that change. It worked reasonably well through most of the years that Russ Feingold was in the Senate, where there were times, no question, that leaders were frustrated. Robert Byrd was frequently frustrated and tried to find ways around it and made some additional changes, but it didn't really block the work of the Senate or create a complete roadblock to dramatically important actions that the Senate might take. And we saw multiple instances where the norm of bipartisan cooperation to try and make important national problems be alleviated or disappear worked quite well. Then came Mitch McConnell. And starting really in the final 2 years of the George W. Bush administration, when Democrats took a majority in the Senate, and Republicans wanted to avoid the Senate and the House passing bills that might be embarrassing to the president, and Republicans began to use the filibuster in a more extended way, but it accelerated dramatically in the Obama years and what we called using the filibuster as a weapon of mass obstruction. Because we're not just talking about having a 60 vote threshold, we're talking about a whole series of tactics and techniques that can be used under the rules to delay and soak up an enormous amount of floor time in the Senate. And I should add, just as a little caveat, that the rules change on nominations did not eliminate a filibuster. It simply moved the cloture motion threshold for those nominations to a majority from 60. But you still file a cloture motion. You have 2 days, legislative days for it to ripen. After you've achieved the 51 votes to overcome it, there is a period of debate that follows. And you can still soak up an enormous amount of time if you want to simply obstruct. It has nothing to do with the qualifications of nominees. When that threshold for nominees was the 2/3 or the 3/5 of the Senate, I should say, what we saw in the Obama years was a frequent use of the filibuster for judicial nominees below the Supreme Court level, for executive nominees, including some that were ultimately confirmed unanimously or near unanimously, so that you could take all this time in which the Senate would have to stop a lot of its work to be able to act on other important things. And that was the strategy followed for the full 8 years of the Obama administration, with the changes finally coming in nominations. Basically, when McConnell went to Harry Reid, the Senate Majority Leader, and said, even though there are multiple vacancies for the second most important court in America, the DC Circuit Court, that handles all the issues of separation of powers, of presidential power, and the like, we're not going to allow any of them to go forward. Doesn't matter how well qualified. It doesn't matter how pristine their records. None of them will move, so we can preserve a conservative majority on that court, which would mean hamstringing the president. And that's when Reid felt compelled to use what has been called the nuclear option to change the rules. So norms matter. And if the norms are shredded, then the rule that could work otherwise doesn't work. The second thing that I want to mention here is that there is a larger norm, which was really highlighted first in a famous book written by a political scientist, Donald R. Matthews, in 1960, famous among political scientists and students, at least, called U.S. Senators and Their World, in which he wrote about folkways. And he talked about the folkway of institutional patriotism. The fact that people coming to the Senate believed that it was this great institution and that their role was to preserve its integrity. And that meant that if people violated the integrity or began to challenge the institution itself, they would unite together across party lines to preserve it. And the fact is, for decades now, and again, I'll take this back to Newt Gingrich and the late 1970s, all the way through his emergence with a majority in 1994, but also in the Senate. Institutional integrity, the belief that you have an obligation to that institution, has been disappearing. It's disappeared in both parties, but more so on the Republican side. You have people who view the institution simply as a vehicle to achieve other goals, individual goals and ideological or theological goals. And with that, it means that when you have an impasse, the willingness of people to come across those lines to work together becomes much, much harder to do. one example I'll give you of institutional integrity is after Bill Clinton was impeached by the House and it moved to a trial in the Senate, the question of whether that would be handled in a purely partisan way or what rules they would establish for that impeachment. We had senators, including Republican leader Trent Lott, Ted Kennedy back at that point, and the Democratic leadership who worked together, both parties, so that they could establish a set of rules that would make the Senate look like it was doing this in a serious fashion. When we had a threat to the filibuster rule over nominations for appeals courts, where Democrats were using the filibuster against a number of George W. Bush appointees, we had a gang of 12, 6 Democrats and 6 Republicans who sat down and said, we can't let this happen, and they worked out a deal. That's an impossibility right now. All of that is gone because our environment is not just polarized, it's tribalized. And we have a strategy that's used by Republicans with a Democratic president of doing what they can to block most items on the agenda and delegitimize what has happened. So the call for change has become much greater. And at the same time, I want to emphasize another element of this that we will come back to, which is an existential threat to our fundamental political system and to our democracy that we see emerging. Obviously, we saw it just yesterday with the statement, not just by Mitch McConnell, but what we've now seen with a large number of others, including today, at least one Republican who voted for an article of impeachment against Donald Trump, Richard Burr, that they will oppose any commission to look at what happened with an armed and violent insurrection against our institutions of government and attempt to topple them on January 6th. But what we also see across a large number of states with laws that are not just aimed at suppressing votes of all kinds of people, primarily people of color, but also many others, but are also trying to impose restrictions so that election results can be overturned in a partisan fashion. And with the inability to find any way of moving forward with a federal law to protect those voting rights, the change in the rule becomes, I think, a necessity that goes beyond what it means for the Senate to what it means for the country as a whole. So what do we do? What ways can we look at? And keep in mind that while there has long been a catch-22 in the Senate rules, the Senate being a continuing body, since it doesn't have to establish new rules every 2 years, unlike the House, where you have a completely new slate. 2/3 of the senators are always there. The rules actually say that you require a 2/3, not 3/5, but 2/3 to change the rules, but they found a workaround for this. You still need 50 senators and a vice president presiding, at least, to find a way to change that rule. And so if you wanted to simply say, we're going to move the threshold to 50 for all legislation, along with the nominations and confirmations, you're still going to have to get those 50 votes. And Democrats have only 50 senators. And we know that there are several who've indicated unease, certainly with eliminating the rule, and in a couple of instances, Kristen Sinema and, of course, the famous Joe Manchin, with making any change at all that would either eliminate or, as Manchin said, weaken the filibuster. Now, Manchin has bought into many of the myths that Sarah shredded. The golden age, the belief that what the filibuster does is to force a strong bipartisan leadership consensus, at least for important legislation. He believes that because he occupies the seat held by Robert Byrd, that Byrd was one of the great protectors of the filibuster. All of those are false, basically. And certainly we know now that finding bipartisan majorities simply won't be there. Joe Manchin actually said, I think wrongly, that there are at least 10 Republicans who will support voting rights legislation. He has found one, Lisa Murkowski. But we also know that simply changing the Voting Rights Act, restoring it with the provisions that were shredded by the Shelby County decision, doesn't do anything for the laws that have already been passed that are deep voter suppression laws like the one in Georgia. So something more needs to be done. More than 10 years ago, I made a proposal working first with former Senator Mark Udall and then with former Senator Al Franken to try and bring back one element of the filibuster that is, I think, the most important if you're going to preserve it at all. When the Senate changed the rule in 1975, they made it 3/5 of the entire Senate. Remember, Sarah said that in 1917, when they changed the rule, they made it 2/3 of those senators present and voting. If you have a present and voting standard, then the image of the Senate that we saw, not so much even in the Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, but in those filibusters against civil rights issues in the 1960s, of senators going round the clock for days on end, sleeping in lumpy cots off the Senate floor to come there. The minority that was trying to block legislation had to do that because if they weren't there, if only 80 senators showed up, then a majority or less could actually vote, as long as they had a quorum of a majority of the Senate, to overcome that filibuster and move to a vote on issues. When you move from a present and voting standard to an absolute standard, there is no burden on the minority. The burden is entirely on the majority. Al Franken called me up as a new member of the Senate because he had gone to a former Republican senator who just the other day was named to the Baseball Hall of Fame, Jim Bunning, who was a remarkable athlete. No hitters in both leagues, the only one to do that, but also a pretty nasty guy in the Senate. But Al wanted to build relationships with senators, and he went to Jim Bunning on a Thursday and said, "See you on Monday." And Bunning said to him, "No, you won't. You have to be there, but I don't, because it's a cloture vote." And Al said to me, "What's this all about?" And I said, if you have a cloture vote, the minority doesn't have to show up at all. They can have one or two people who are there to object to the absence of a quorum or to make sure there's not a unanimous consent agreement doing terrible things to them. But if you don't show up, nothing will happen. And one of the signature moments in the shredding of the norms and the nature of this modern rule came during the debate on the Affordable Care Act, when Robert Byrd, who held Joe Manchin's seat, was almost literally on his deathbed. There were just 60 Democratic senators. Not a single Republican was going to vote to overcome the filibuster on the Affordable Care Act. And they had to wheel in Robert Byrd from a gurney to a wheelchair onto the Senate floor, where he showed what he thought about the way the filibuster rule was operating by shaking his fist at his Republican colleagues and shouting, "Shame, shame." That's what's happened to the rule, and the burden is entirely on the majority. So what I suggested at that point is we flip the numbers. Instead of having 60 senators required to end debate, have 41 senators required to continue debate. Now, that's not going to eliminate the problem. And frankly, that change alone isn't going to give us S1 or HR1, the For the People Act. Mitch McConnell would view that as his top priority, going to whatever lengths he could to block it from happening. But if you put the burden on the minority, then the use of the filibuster as a weapon of mass destruction, obstruction, using it for everything, small issues, big issues, issues that are widely supported, issues that are not, goes away because there's a burden on them there. And if you couple it with what is a proposal made for a long time by Senator Jeff Merkley of Oregon, the talking filibuster, where you have to actually be on the floor and talking to maintain the ability to continue debate, and make it that they have to have 41 there, then you're going to make it more difficult for them. And if you then go round the clock They have to be there. The majority does as well to make a quorum. But you can use hardball to make it extremely difficult for them to do so. And a lot of things that can't happen now would happen then. If you simply shifted the rule to make it a present and voting standard, 3/5 of those present and voting, you also require them to be there if you have sessions on Mondays and Fridays and around the clock. If you make it difficult for them if they're back home to get back in time. Senators don't want to spend all their time in Washington, and you can put up the heat on them. Now, frankly, if I could do anything on my own, if I could wave a magic wand to bring about a change right now, given the existential threat to the fundamentals of our political system, while still maintaining some ability for a minority that feels intensely about something to be able to put a spotlight on an issue and rally public opinion if they can to block it from happening, I would embrace a proposal made a couple of decades ago by former Senator Tom Harkin of Iowa, which is a sliding scale. You start with 60 votes required to end debate and move to a vote, but after a week, say, you move to 57. After 2 weeks, you move to 54. And after 3 weeks, you move to a simple majority. Give them time to make their case, but then let a majority rule. Now, there are other proposals out there. One is to simply do a single shot and say you're going to move the standard to 50 or to a majority for election-related issues. The Constitution, after all, gives Congress the clear authority to regulate the time, manner, and place of elections. So you can deal with this existential threat without changing the rule dramatically for everything else. We have a proposal that's out there by 3 political scientists, including our longtime friend and colleague, Ken Shepsley of Harvard, to say that you could have debates stopped by a majority that represent a majority of the population of the United States. The fact is now, you could have senators theoretically representing 11% to 20% of the country who represent 40 senators who could block any action from 41 senators block any action from happening now. And that's an elegant, if slightly more complicated way of dealing with the reality. And there's one other reality I would mention here. Of course, the blunt reality is we need to get 50 senators if we're going to make any of these changes. And you have to find a way to get Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema. And I think if Manchin goes, Sinema, others who are reluctant, like Dianne Feinstein and probably 3 or 4 others who are more veterans of the Senate would go along if you can bring about this change by making it clear to them that moving to a 41 standard or even a 45 standard preserves the rights of the minority, but puts the burden on them where it belongs. But keep in mind that minority rights in the Senate are baked into this process. Right now, Democrats have 50 senators. Republicans have 50 senators. But those Republicans represent 41 million fewer people in the United States than the 50 Democrats. So there's plenty of protection for the minority in the Senate right now without a rule that hamstrings a majority in perpetuity. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ornstein. That gives us an awful lot to think about. We're now going to move to our question and answer period. And I have some questions in the Q&A, which I will get to in a short while, but we're going to start off with a question from Jerry Goldfeder, who is on the Election Law Committee, our co-sponsor with the Rule of Law Task Force of this program. And he's going to throw out the first pitch, as it were. So take it away, Jerry.
Thank you very much, Judge, and it's great to be with all of you. You really, you hit the nail on the head. There really is a lot to chew on by these that been presented by these panelists. Really terrific folks who've made tremendous contributions to our republic over many years. And you're absolutely right, Norm. There is a existential crisis in our country. We saw it on January 6th. We see it in the state legislatures in many states. who are eviscerating voting rights and really challenging the way votes will be counted and honored. And I might even add that even if the For the People Act passes and the John Lewis Act passes, states can still, since Congress only governs federal elections, states can still set up their state elections in ways that deprive people of voting and miscount votes. We're going to see if, even if Congress passes the legislation, what they do in Georgia in the next gubernatorial election, because they're intent on keeping their rules in place that deprive people from voting. But having said all that, I want to use the metaphor of tracking to ask a two-part question, which is, you've all addressed the genesis of the filibuster and how it works and how it hurts our democracy. And so I would like to ask this question, which is, we see how reconciliation, the budgetary process, is a way of circumventing the filibuster. And we see the filibuster has been so-called reformed by eliminating various subjects such as certain nominations. So that said, are there other ways of circumventing the filibuster? Chuck Schumer, our senator, continues to say he has things up his sleeve with regard to how to pass the Voting Rights Act and other legislation. What other ways can be utilized within the system that currently exists to actually reform the filibuster? And the second track is, not only do we have an existential crisis in the country in terms of our democratic institutions, but we also have a crisis in terms of people believing that Washington is broken. Now, that's not a new feeling, but nevertheless, it continues. And we have institutions that are anachronistic. The Electoral College, gerrymandering, the filibuster is an example. The Senate itself, for the very reasons Norm touched on in terms of still having 2 senators for each state. Now, we can amend the Constitution, and it's difficult to amend the Constitution, except there's a provision in the Constitution that says if we want to amend the way the Senate is constructed, you need not 2/3, not 3/4, you need 100%. So it's very difficult to change the structure of many of our anachronistic institutions. But I think we need to really work on 2 tracks. How do we deal with the current procedure of the filibuster? How do we reform it? And how do we step back? How do we ask ourselves and come to some conclusions about how to reform our very basic institutions that have been around for 230 years that don't seem to work anymore? So I'd like to know what your thoughts are on these subjects.
Who would like to start us off? Everybody's rushing to do that. Norm, go
Well,
right
let
ahead.
me deal with the second part of Jerry's question. I actually think even if we get past this current crisis and impasse, we have a bigger issue with the Senate. And that is the population shifts that are moving it further and further away from representing the country as a whole. We're pretty close to the point where 70% of Americans will live in just 15 states, 50% of Americans in 8 states. Now flip that around, and what it means is 30% of Americans will elect 70 senators. And while it's true that, it's not like these small states are all red and the big states are all blue. We have a Delaware, we have a Maine, we have a Texas and a Florida and others that are red on the other side. But the fact is that the 30% do not in any way reflect the diversity of the country or the economic dynamism of the country. You know, 2/3 of the GDP and the growth in the country are coming from that small number of states. So we're going to end up, I think, with a big problem ahead regardless. And there's going to be a widespread sense in the country that our votes don't matter, even if they're not suppressed, because we're not seeing a reflection of where the country is. And of course, the Electoral College becomes an increasing distortion as well. So how do you get around the catch-22 that's in Article 5? I would say what I would like to see, and this of course has very little chance of happening, is a constitutional amendment where we add a dozen senators who are at large in some fashion. You're not violating every state having an equal number of senators. They'll still all have 2 senators. But say we elect 4 senators nationally, staggered, of course, in presidential and non-presidential years, and 8 others in regions that are grouped by population. You're going to change the focus of those senators. They're going to have a greater level of legitimacy in some ways and more traction. But you'd also alter the makeup of the Senate. Now, frankly, if I could also do what I wanted, I would add DC, Puerto Rico, and the US Virgin Islands as states right now. That brings more diversity, and it also brings in people who ought to be represented in the Senate. That can be done by simple majority, preceded by a referendum on each of the states. You'd have an added benefit in the Electoral College because the Constitution says that the federal district, what you'd have to do to make the DC a state is you'd have to separate out a federal district, which you could do by circumscribing the area around the Capitol, the White House, the cabinet offices, and the like. They still get 3 electoral votes in the Constitution. Then you'd add 3 more for what becomes the state of the District of Columbia. I'd be all for that. But obviously that doesn't happen unless you change the filibuster. And if Democrats had won 53 or 54 seats in 2020 instead of barely eking out a majority with those 2 special elections in Georgia, I think you'd probably have the votes to make a lot of these things happen. Not the constitutional amendment, but some of the other changes. Now, on the issue of workarounds, I'll let the others talk, but I don't see any workarounds other than the reconciliation bill, which doesn't deal with issues like voting rights.
Thank you. Russ, did you want to speak
Yeah,
up?
I'd like to follow on that and just answer the part about, whatever Chuck Schumer has up his sleeve, he can do it because of Article 1's grant of the power to the Senate to create its own rules. And so whether it's reinstating the talking filibuster, creating exceptions to the rule, I love Norm's idea about reversing the rule about who has to show up and who doesn't. The Tom Harkin bringing down the number for a filibuster, how many senators it takes to break a filibuster. All of this can be done by rule. And so when Norm talks about this terrible rise of malapportionment and the lack of representation of diversity in the Senate, you could even do things like what has been referred to, the idea that Marcy was talking to us about a week ago, the proposal by Jonathan Gould and Kenneth Shepsel and Matthew Stevenson, where the filibuster would be premised on population, that you would actually count the ability to cut off debate based on population. Now, that'd be awfully hard to get through. Easier than a constitutional amendment, I can tell you, but all of this can be done. And so the point I want to make, Marcy, is basically the courts won't look at any of this. Somebody might come in and say, well, this, violates the Constitution and you can't do this. This has been generally viewed under justiciability and political question as entirely within the province of the Senate. Now, there is one exception here, and it affects what Norm was talking about. Article 5 says that one thing is unamendable. 2 things are now archaic. The equal representation of the states, which Sherry was referring to, is actually unamendable under the language of Article 5. Now, there's some scholars have written about how you could somehow get around that, and there's language there about making all the states consent, but that is a very, of course, it has to do with slavery originally and the original compromise. But that is essentially the only thing in the US Constitution that in theory anyway, cannot be amended. Which is, so the idea of a workaround where you do the filibuster rule based on population size, I'm not necessarily endorsing it, but that would be a way to deal with this problem without actually having to amend the Constitution or not being able.
Don't you think Article 5 can be amended so that that provision no
That
longer
is one
has
of
any
those,
force
how
and
many
effect?
heads there are, how many angels are there on a head of a pin? Possibly, yes. Possibly, yes.
So Professor Bender, did you want to weigh in on this?
Well, I mean, I think the combination of Norman, Senator Feingold's compilation here of workarounds is pretty exhaustive. The only thing I would add is that for the last decade plus, roughly, the changes in rules have not really been formal, with few exceptions, have not really been formal changes. They have been reinterpretations of the rules, a fancy way of saying the nuclear option. But in the absence of 50 votes, 50, in this case, Democratic votes, the threat of going nuclear to the Republicans is just, it's not credible. And so there's very little incentive for Republicans to come to the table, even to negotiate small changes in Rule 22, which we saw happen between Reid and McConnell, 2011, 2012, 2013. Most of those faded away. Some of them stuck. So incremental changes, just example, there used to be 3 motions you could filibuster to get the Senate into conference with the House. That's now down to 1 through a negotiated settlement. But it's hard to foresee these with Manchin having written off currently any possibility, he says, of changing the rules. So I think the Senate is really stuck here unless there's any threat of going nuclear. It's just there's no incentive for Republicans to want to come to the table.
Let me just follow up on that, Sarah. I mean, do you think that can really be put together, the nuclear option, or do the impediments, the things that are preventing Senators Manchin and Sinema and perhaps others from joining forces, would prevent a rule change by the Senate Majority Leader?
Well, it just feels they're sort of in frozen zone here, with various folks trying to convince Manchin that, and Sinema, and possibly, as Norm suggested, some others along the line there, that everyone trying to convince them that your idea of securing 60 or more Republicans for any of these top initiatives for the Democrats, trying to convince them that that's not going to happen. People keep saying we haven't seen any filibusters this Congress. I'm not sure I would agree with that comment, because the fact that some things haven't come to the floor is because they don't have 60 votes. We keep looking for these test cases. What would convince Manchin? We may yet get there this Congress, but shy of those 50, it's off. Those types of reforms are off the table.
Let me talk for a minute about Manchin and sort of what I would like to see happening. And I would say one of the really bad things about the rule as it exists now is, as Sarah just said, there are things that are not directly filibustered, because when they come to the Senate, the majority knows they don't have the votes and they just don't bring them up. And that means they don't get any public focus. So here's an example. We had 2 bills for universal background checks on guns pass the House. 94% of Americans in some surveys support those. Filibustered in the Senate, they don't come up. There's no onus on people who oppose things that are supported by an overwhelming majority of Americans, because they're not put on the spot. One of the things that I've suggested to try and overcome the misconceptions that Manchin has is bring up now the Manchin-Toomey gun bill, a thoroughly bipartisan bill that was filibustered in the Senate after the horrible Newtown massacre and didn't go anywhere. And if that gets filibustered after going again through the regular order, that should say to Joe Manchin, this rule is not working. I'd like to bring up now the Voting Rights Act. It was debated in the House in the last Congress. The House has not even introduced it at this point for this Congress, but bring it up as much as anything to watch it filibustered and killed, and then going to Joe Manchin and saying, we're not trying to weaken or eliminate the filibuster. We are trying to restore it to what it was supposed to be and see if we can get somewhere with that. The idea that these rules promote bipartisanship in the absence of norms, what we saw happening with the American Rescue Act, which we knew could go through in reconciliation with just 50 votes, and the 50 votes were there, should have been an enormous incentive for Republicans to negotiate a compromise. And in fact, Joe Biden was ready to do a compromise. It might have reduced the number from 1.9 trillion to 1.7 trillion. It might have reduced the amount of money going to states when it turns out that they're actually running surpluses. They might have changed, created more market things. Instead, what the Republicans who said they wanted a compromise, it was they offered a $600 billion proposal and didn't want to budge much from that, which made it clear it was a sham. There was no compromise there. Give a few examples along those lines, and maybe you'll get the willingness to get those 50 votes. In the absence of that, we get nowhere.
Yeah, thank you. Very, very encouraging. Let me just go to one of the questions that we've received from a member of our audience. Michael Obis writes, regardless of legislative priorities, ideology, or partisan motivations, which have been the focus of much of what we've been talking about today, how can the filibuster procedure completely overtake the clear terms and intent of Article 1, which provides for supermajority only in certain enumerated circumstances? Aren't Americans entitled to be governed pursuant to the express terms of the Constitution, he asks.
Marcy, I mean, the Constitution does not expressly say that. It does not say that just because you have a 2/3 vote on treaties or a 2/3 vote on nominations, that therefore everything else should be by majority. It doesn't say that. Now, a lot of people argue that that's implicit, that the fact that it was chosen to be done for those two means that it was intended to be a majority on everything else, but courts have not found that persuasive. And I don't find it overwhelmingly persuasive because Article 1, Section 5, as Sarah pointed out, gives the Senate the right to, and the House as well, the right to make their own rules. And there is no indication in terms of Supreme Court rulings or other rulings that a super majority for debate violates that provision. So, maybe, this whole issue that Jerry was bringing up, the reality that the Senate itself is malapportioned, and that the filibuster greatly enhances that malapportionment. Maybe somehow the courts would change their mind and get involved, but in terms of the classic notion of what Article 1, Section 5 means, is that you really don't have an established legal principle that everything has to be done by majority vote unless it says otherwise. I don't think that's the case.
Right. So do the members of the panel, in some sense, I think we got some sense from Russ Feingold about this, but is there a useful role given today's partisanship in saving the rule of law for in saving the filibuster that in a ways that would promote the rule of law in American governance? Or have we gotten to a point where the partisanship and the abandonment of the norms that Norm has been talking about make it just impossible? All of the suggestions that we've heard about reforms would require votes that aren't there now to overcome it, partly because of the partisanship. partly because of the abandonment of norms. One of our audience members writes, that's Daniel Brooks, didn't Senator Joseph McCarthy break the norms back in the 1950s? And somehow we managed to get through that without an existential threat, without the realization of the existential threat. In that instance, what can we really do? Should we be concentrating on civics education in our schools? I know that the Rule of Law Task Force has that as a project together with some of the other committees here at the city bar. But how can we deal with all of these problems? Norm, do you have some thoughts about that?
We're in a very difficult time. January 6th was a clear and present danger to all of us. And, breaching the Capitol with a noose, going after the vice president, the threat directly to the lives of members of Congress, staff, and others who were there. And now we saw just yesterday, Mike Pence's brother voted against the creation of a commission to get to the bottom of what happened on January 6th and who was behind it. We have some senators who are retiring. I worked with Roy Blunt a fair amount when he was in the House. He was an institutionalist, and he's retiring now. And his loyalty went to Mitch McConnell when he opposed the creation of a commission here. Richard Burr, who actually did some terrific things as the chairman and then ranking member of the Intelligence Committee, stood up for America against the Russian threat, now opposed to a commission to deal with an armed insurrection against the Capitol, our most precious building. When I look at the next generation of potential, the pool of potential candidates for Congress, the party chairs, the Republican Party chairs and party officials, the state legislators, they're much closer to Marjorie Taylor Greene than they are to, say, Mitt Romney or Liz Cheney, who is as conservative as anybody I've ever encountered, but at least has the fundamental norm of protecting our democracy. And she is purged from the leadership of the party. We're going to be dealing with this for a significant period of time. I believe the 2022 elections are absolutely critical. If Republicans capture one or both houses of Congress, then whatever happens with the presidential election in 2024, it will come to the House and they will overturn the results of the election. We're facing a fundamental threat right now, and that's one reason why, if we don't protect voting rights, then the 2022 elections are going to be tilted in a very bad way. I don't want to be a Cassandra here, but I think we all have to recognize that we have not faced a threat like this before. One final comment. Wisconsin is one of the most, maybe the most interesting state if we look through the course of American history. We have had giants like Robert La Follette, Gaylord Nelson, Russ Feingold. And then we've had the Joseph McCarthys and the Ron Johnsons. We've had a place that's been the birthplace of some of the most important figures promoting the important values of the country. Remember, Gaylord Nelson created Earth Day. Nobody was more prescient about the danger to the climate. La Follette spearheaded the progressive reforms that created really the capacity for us to grow as a country. Russ was a defender of the Constitution in ways we have rarely seen during his time there. The dark side, along with the bright side of America, is reflected there, but now the dark side has expanded across the country, and it's very hard to find traction for just simply preserving the fundamental norms of how you operate, that if you lose, you move on, that people on the other side of the aisle are adversaries. They may be misguided, but they're not the enemy. And right now, of course, we also have a tribal media, starting with what the Murdochs have done, that makes it even more difficult. Keep in mind that even as of today, roughly 70% of Republicans believe the election was stolen from Donald Trump. A majority of Republicans in the country do not believe in compromise. 30% or close to it of Republicans have said that if things go wrong, violence may not be out of the question for overcoming them. We're in a very difficult place that I have not seen in my lifetime.
Marcy, if I may follow on that, because I think that's exactly right. This has less to do with whether the filibuster continues and more to do with the tenor of the times. And so I guess, because this is a serious and important conversation we're having, I think it is necessary to at least reform the filibuster. But the answer typically is, well, look out for what you wish for. Just think what Mitch McConnell will do that if they take over. Well, my answer to that, based on what Norm was just saying, is why concern yourself with that? They'll do it anyway. I mean, literally, if they want to get rid of the filibuster, if they do something, they'll just do it because they have no respect for the norms. The fact that he's predicting they're going to screw around with the next presidential election, this is small potatoes compared to what they're willing to do, including being supportive of people that breach the Capitol. So that doesn't mean we shouldn't try, but I don't think we should be as afraid as I would have been in the past of reforming the filibuster on some belief that they will restrain themselves if we don't do it. It's not believable.
That answers one of the questions that we've received from Albert Foyer, I think, about the tables being turned. And, you know, I did think that this proposal by Professors Gould and Shepsley and Stevenson that both Russ and Norm have talked about, it is very interesting. You know, the government by the minority, we've really gotten used to that now. And from what all of you are telling us, we're going to see a lot more of that. Regardless of who wins the next elections, if most of the population is represented by a minority of the members of the Senate, that's what we're going to see. So, you know, I think there's some reason to think that a key part of the problem lies in the inherent structure of the Senate, as you all are saying. So would you think that measure, the popular majoritarian cloture rule that those three professors are proposing, which would eliminate the current requirement of 3/5 of the members to agree to proceed to a vote and instead require the assent of a majority of the senators who collectively represent a larger share of the population than do the senators opposing cloture. And they would apply it to all Senate votes, by the way, including budget reconciliation and confirmation of appointments. And they point out that a minority of senators could still block legislation, but only if they collectively represented a majority of the population. Yes, I hear you, Norm. This is complicated, and the authors themselves say that this would require the nuclear option. And we are not able to quite muster that now. But wouldn't that, like a combination of the proposals that Norm has made and discussed with us, wouldn't that go a long way to eliminating partisanship, including what we've just been talking about? If the tables are turned and the Democrats are the minority, it still would prevent the minority from governing. So given the fact that anything is difficult to accomplish, do you think that would be a fair and enduring and nonpartisan way to solve the problem, regardless of who wins the next elections? I'll take any answer from any of you great thinkers. Sarah.
Well, I guess maybe this is sort of obvious, but the challenge, or an additional challenge here, is that in the short term, this is both a small d democratic reform, but it's also a large d democratic reform. As we know, Democrats benefit once you start to think about population-based measures, given where Democrats live. Now, that's not immutable. Texas, for sure, large majorities, changing partisanship. And so I think it's hard to talk about using the word, it depends what one means by fair, because there will be partisan implications for most of these intended changes, potential changes to the cloture rule.
I think it's an intriguing one, but I just don't know how you would get a majority of the senators to vote for this. I mean, each state has 2 senators, and all of a sudden you're going to hand all of this influence to 3 or 4 states. I don't know how you even get the majority for a nuclear option to do it. I'm sure the authors have an answer for that, but I don't know what it is. It just seems sort of impossible.
So that's, of course, they both made a key point here. Practically speaking, this is a very big reach. Now, would it be a good thing to do, given that we see the growing imbalance, the 70% living in 15 states? Yes, but even Democrats from small states are going to be hesitant to do this. Just as we've seen in the past that whenever there was an attempt to alter the rules or the norms surrounding the hold, theoretically, something that has been frustrating to large numbers of senators, the ability, the leverage that individuals have is still precious to them and very important to them. And sometimes that overcomes the institutional imperatives. I want to make one more point about the Mitch McConnell, if the tables were turned, because people often say, well, in the first 2 years of the Trump administration, they had the House, the Senate, and the White House. Why didn't McConnell change the rules then? First, we know that McConnell, in a nanosecond, changes rules if it works to his advantage or changes norms. They did it with the blue slip, which Pat Leahy, as chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, is a Democrat, held on to, despite enormous pressure from many of his colleagues, because he thought if we change it, they'll change it. And he didn't change it, and they did as soon as it was an obstacle, just as, of course, McConnell did it with the Supreme Court. So why didn't he change the rule on the filibuster for legislation when they had all the reins of power? Because McConnell had 2 goals, and only 2 significant goals. One was to get this ginormous tax cut. The second was to jam through as many judges as he possibly could. On the second, all he had to do was change the rule further on Supreme Court justices. On the tax cuts, he could do it with reconciliation. If there was a third legislative goal, it was repeal and replace Obamacare, which they tried to do with a majority, and they couldn't even get a majority for that because they still don't have a replace plan. So he had no reason to change the rules. There was no greater agenda. Anything else that they wanted to do was going to be done by fiat by President Trump. If you move them into a position where they need to make changes in the legislation, there is nothing that would block Mitch McConnell from making those changes. And every time a journalist refers to him as an institutionalist, it gives me great heartburn.
Understood. Well, but following up on what you're saying, Norm, would that mean that there should be a focus now on, as Russ was talking about, eliminating the filibuster for a few categories of legislation, like civil rights and voting rights? Is that more realistic? Should smaller incremental bites be our focus?
Whatever Joe Manchin would agree to is fine with me, if we can get him to agree to anything. But I would, come back to what I said in my initial remarks. On the voting rights questions, this is an existential threat to our future. And if I could only get the change in the rules to get through the key elements, I think the For the People Act actually has some questionable things in it. I'd like to see it amended a little bit. I'd be okay getting it because it's important, but the core parts of that need to be done. And if you can convince Manchin and Sinema to simply do the single shot for election related issues, and we get those bills through, I would be very, very happy. If you can't do that and you can flip the numbers, it's not as good because we might not get the voting rights changes, but we've got a fighting chance where now we have no chance.
Marcy, if I could just add that I think there's a real chance of this happening with Manchin and Sinema, because what you are talking about here, voting rights and civil rights, is about the Jim Crow legacy aspect of the filibuster. It's about the shame of the filibuster's abuse in the past. And so when people talk about the Jim Crow legacy, what I like to say is what you have here with these efforts across the country that we need to undo is Jim Crow now, Jim Crow again. That's really what it is trying to prevent people from voting. So this is a pretty good example of where you can have exceptions. As Norm just said, he would take it without it opening the door to everything, given the legacy of the filibuster.
Very good. So are there other protections other than the ones that the three professors posit that can be offered to groups in minority populations that are concerned about the tyranny of the majority? If majority population vote controls, this is a question from Karen Olin. How can we protect? I think she's talking about the maybe the Shepsley-Gould proposal, but to avoid the tyranny of the majority. I mean, it would be complicated, as you've all said. But are there other methods that come to mind historically that protect minority rights that we ought to be thinking about as we talk to people, if we talk to the senators who are reluctant to make any changes? Is that an issue that we should be looking at? Sarah?
Well, I think we have on the table a pretty almost exhaustive list of potential and tracks of reform. I think I would just go up a level of abstraction for a moment, just to remind us that historically, just to make explicit, that reform of the rules, particularly debate rules, has almost always been tied to a particular policy issue that senators don't, and I don't mean to speak for Senator Feingold, but senators don't typically have views about rules independent of how they want to use them to achieve their policy or political goals. And so that's why, or one reason why, the carve out through the nuclear option were one to convince Manchin and Sinema is really a quite, in my view, the most pragmatic way of thinking about how are you going to secure a majority for reform, right? That is to tie it distinctly to the inability to secure a particular policy outcome. And that is what we learned historically by thinking about the episodes of reform. I had another point come through my head that just went straight out the window there about majorities. Oh, I think one thing to keep in mind here is we are on a historical line here, and every time majorities have used what we now call the nuclear option, although we have seen these interpretations, or what we used to call reform by ruling, we saw them in the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, and we saw Bob Byrd do them in the late 70s and 80s. But every time you go that way, right, circumventing the formal rules to change the rules, it becomes all the more easier, I think, to do it again, because, well, first of all, we saw it with nomination nuclear options. Reid took a lot of political heat from Republicans for doing it, but once he did it, Republicans considered reversing. They wanted nothing to do with that. And in fact, when they nuked the Supreme Court filibusters barely a few years later, they just pointed to the Democrats to say, well, Democrats did it, so we can do it. So it's all set up for blame avoidance, right? And it has lowered the cost, because now we know that a concerted majority has a track record here of reinterpreting the rules in a really serious way. And that lessens the ability of rules can't protect themselves, but it lowers the institutional cost of doing it again. And so the combination of fusing procedure and policy, but also recognizing that we have lots of episodes now behind us to point to, it does suggest that reform could well be easier down the line than it seemingly is today.
Is that part of what you mean by the arc is bending toward reforming the filibuster, the legislative filibuster?
Yeah, I mean, we don't, and Senator Shelby really said it best. You can't, you squeeze the toothpaste out, you can't get it back in the tube. And because I think about how Republican senators reacted after Democrats went nuclear over nomination filibusters in 2014, after they regained control of the Senate, they had conference debates about whether or not to reinstate the rule. So, and they didn't need it. They didn't need a 60 vote majority anymore because they just never called up the Obama nominations in 2015 and 2016. But I think it was Roy Blunt, Senator Blunt said, look, it makes sense. We have majority rule for nominations and we have supermajority rule for legislation. Like he said it made sense. Barely 2 months earlier, 3 months earlier, they were railing against Harry Reid for quote unquote killing the Senate. So senators internalize these and they create new traditions all the time. And so just because a senator or a Senate party one day says this is an abomination, once they're in the majority and can benefit from it, it suddenly becomes a new tradition of the Senate. So there's no, and this gets back to the origins, right? There's no natural, original, intended version of the Senate. And that's the whole point of that rulemaking clause, right? That senators over the years can choose the rules that they think work best for their particular agendas or the institution. And we should think of that as natural and appropriate.
Sir, I just want to say I think it's such a powerful point because, let's remember, so they make more changes now. There was no cloture rule at all for 150 years. There was nothing. I'm sure people thought the sky was falling, but cloture rule was created. And the same thing with these arguments about the Supreme Court, frankly. Oh, you have to have 9 justices. We all know that's gone back and forth quite a few times. So these notions that certain things are permanent or inherent, or that the republic's going to fall if we make an exception for voting rights and civil rights, I just don't think it bears a test of time, as Sarah just pointed out.
So
Marcy, I have
yes, sure.
another question.
Yes, Jerry, go ahead.
Another rule of law question, if I may. Let's assume, it's a big assumption, let's assume we get some reform to the filibuster. And let's even assume that the 2 voting rights laws get passed by Congress. What we're seeing in a variety of states are laws that really exemplify what we call democratic backsliding. There are procedures being put in place whereby legislatures can essentially ignore the totals of the votes in a presidential election or in any other election, such that what could have happened in 2020 and didn't happen could happen in 2024. The votes are a candidate wins with 20,000 votes in a particular state, but the legislature doesn't agree with the local elected officials, and therefore they award the state to the other team, to the other candidate. And we see that happening in the way elected election officials are being replaced and how their authority is being undermined in a few states. So I'd like to know what you think about whether or not there is a remedy for this utilization of the law to chip away at the law.
So who would like to take that?
It's actually even worse than you suggested, Jerry, because what these states are doing is building in criminal penalties for
Yes.
local election officials who violate what they're doing to suppress votes by making it easier for people to vote. And that means that they're going to be able to put enormous pressure on election officials by threatening to jail them if they don't bow to their desires. I would point out that we came dangerously close to catastrophe in 2020. If Georgia had gone the other way, if the Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, and his colleagues had bowed, then Joe Biden would have had 290 electoral votes instead of 306. Pennsylvania, I believe the legislature under those circumstances would have put forward a different slate of electors to try and create a contest in the House and Senate.
Mhm.
And remember that it wasn't clear at all on January 6th that we would have a Democratic majority in the Senate. And then if we had had that contest, we're down to 270 electoral votes. All it would have taken is one rogue elector. And remember,
that
most
Michigan-
states
and that
have either
Michigan guy,
no penalty for rogue electors or a civil fine of $1,000. Somebody could offer an elector $1 million and potentially change that vote, send it to the House where it requires a majority of the states, and Republicans had a majority of the states. So we're hanging by a thread here. And these laws are making it much, much more difficult. And that takes us back to where we began. This is an existential moment, and you cannot let a rule of the Senate stand in the way. Now, that doesn't mean we solve all the problems. There's still possibilities for bad actors to force an election in the wrong direction against what the voters have actually voted. But if you don't make some of these changes to provide some safeguards, we could be in a situation that's not far from what we've seen in many, many countries with authoritarian leaders.
I'm sure that many of the people watching today are wondering, what can we do? I mean, I know that there are some voting rights groups that are canvassing in West Virginia and getting people to call Senator Manchin, who are West Virginia residents, and things like that. But as a bar association, should we be perhaps putting out some sort of a report? Would that help at all? That reviews and maybe endorses some of the many proposals we've discussed today, or focuses on the need to carve out an exception, at least for voting rights measures. Do you think that would be some sort of helpful gesture, or are we just adding to the cacophony here? Politically, it's not really going to move the people who need to be moved.
Well, I think connecting the rule of law principle in what you would write to the need to protect voting rights is well worth doing, and putting it in the context of the filibuster. This is a very appropriate thing for a bar association to pursue, and I think it would be a good thing. Getting into all the nuances of the filibuster and all that, that's difficult, but basically saying this is a bottom line, that this democracy cannot afford to have voting rights overridden by anything, including the filibuster, I think is something worth expressing in whatever document you would do.
Okay. Let me see. I have another question from one of our attendees here. Mr. Foyer again says, do you folks think the courts will save us from the voter suppression efforts of the Republican state legislatures, regardless of what Congress does? Didn't the courts do that in 2020? Oh, Russ is shaking his head no. You're still muted, Russ.
My answer is not often enough. They might do it sometimes, but I'm very, very concerned. The Chief Justice, who I voted for, because I thought we could do worse, and I think I was right about that. I do not like his attitude in general about these voting issues, and I'm very nervous about it.
Norm?
I view the Shelby County decision as one of the worst and most shocking I've ever seen. And it that Chief Justice Roberts has not changed his views is a very, very troubling element of this. Remember that the Voting Rights Act amendments went through a pretty extensive process in the House and Senate, looking at what jurisdictions had a long time, including recent history of suppressing votes of people of color, and passed unanimously in one house and near unanimously in the other, and was just thrown out, with Chief Justice Roberts basically saying, look, it's worked. There is no more discrimination based on race. We don't need this anymore. And of course, Ruth Bader Ginsburg had, I think, the appropriate analogy. That's like saying you have your umbrella up in the middle of a driving rainstorm and you say, well, I don't need this anymore. I'm not getting rained upon. And you take away the umbrella. Now, what we saw was that in the immediate aftermath of Shelby County, even in Shelby County, they started to change the laws to provide restrictions on voting of people of color. And we've seen it all across the country. Removing the pre-clearance provisions made it much, much harder. Were there judges who stepped up to the plate, including some who had been appointed or nominated by Donald Trump? Yes. With this Supreme Court, with the 6 justices who are there, do I think there is any possibility that they would stand up again in the face of a lot of these changes? I wish I could say yes, but the answer is no.
Well, so let me just see. I think we have put forth all of the questions from our audience. I don't see any others coming in unless any of the panelists have any further last minute conversation or comments that you'd like to wrap up with, which is fine as far as I'm concerned. We may have gotten close to the end. I think maybe we're there. So let me just say that this has been a wonderfully robust conversation, and on such a critical, and as has been said, existential topic. I'm so glad that we got the help of Sarah Binder, Russ Feingold, and Norm Ornstein to help us become more attuned to the problems and get a better sense of the context and the history, and for their stimulating thoughts and presentations. I want to thank also my colleague on the program committee from the Rule of Law Task Force, Peter Karangia, who has helped plan and shepherd this program, for all of his help and work on it, and Steve Cass, the chair of the Rule of Law Task Force, whose role is just indescribably helpful on all things that we do. I thank Jerry Goldfeder for being with us and for his insightful comments and questions, and also the Election Law Committee for co-sponsoring this with us. And I want to thank the audience for being with us and sticking with us today. The program was recorded, so I do think that you will be able to tune into it on the City Bar website. Of course, I'm not quite right when I say there are no more questions. There are some, I see, I guess a question about the likelihood of constitutional amendments, but I'm thinking that yes, some would be good, and Norm in particular has outlined some that might be great. But if you remember the Equal Rights Amendment and how it never became law, you know just how hard it is to get the Constitution amended, even on things that everybody likes. But we do have we do have news that both the Election Law Committee and the Rule of Law Task Force are doing some work on voting rights issues, and you should stay tuned, and hopefully they will be helpful to the cause. Again, I thank everybody for participating today, and this concludes our program. Thank you.